Hello, and welcome to the Grief Care community. I'm Veronica Goines, co-pastor of Forest Hill Church Presbyterian. If you're joining us for the first time, then I would invite you to contact our church office at office@fhcpresb.org to register for the course and to be able to receive the links and materials for the course. We're going to jump right in today, so let us begin with a time of centering in prayer. I invite you to just find your way to a place that is comfortable for you. If you're someone who prefers being on the floor, then you're welcome to do so, or to sit in your comfy chair, but be sure that you are supported as I lead us in this time of prayer and centering. Let us begin with deep breaths. Breathe in deeply for 5 breaths. In and out. Notice the warmth of your breath as it passes over your lip. With each inhale, bring your attention to the rise and fall of your belly. With each exhale, follow your breath for as long as you can, pushing it out and out and out. Simply breathe as the tensions drain from your forehead, your face, neck, down your shoulders, and out your back, down your arms, through your fingers, and out. With your palms facing upward, just above your lap, bring to mind your pain. Name your loss, your grief. Bring all of this to focus. And in the presence of God, name your loved one. Name your loss, your grief. Gently release your pain into the palms of your hands and sit with it just for a bit. Honor your deep and abiding love. And now envision God's hands, God's palms, sliding beneath yours. And as you are ready, turn your palms downward as a sign of entrusting to God your grief, your care, and your unbearable loss. Entrust and turn it over to God. Your confusion, fear, your longing, perplexity, anger, you name what it is, and relinquish it to God. God is able to bear your pain. Loving God, thank you for bearing our pain. We entrust it to you. In the name of Jesus. Amen. And as we transition to our lesson today, our study, I want to just recapture grief and the definition of grief, just briefly defined. Grief is the normal human reaction to loss, a natural, universal, and stressful experience that comprehensively affects the bereaved at the emotional, physical, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of our being. Today's didactic focuses on the second task of grieving, accepting the reality of the loss. Adjusting to an environment without the deceased will be our lesson for the following week, so you'll want to be sure to return for that. But today, as we focus on accepting the reality of the loss, this requires perpetual confirmation of our senses. To accept a loss is not something that happens instantaneously. In fact, we live at a disadvantage now in some ways, in many ways, because when we think about prior to the mid-century, in the early 1900s and even prior to that, when a loved one dies, that one was cared for in the home. Their body was washed and bathed and clothed and prepared for burial right there in the family room. There were no undertakers involved, no middleman. It was simply the family caring for their loved one as before. So therefore, the death was more easily perceived because they had an immediate experience of death. Accepting the reality of the loss means that we acknowledge the irreversibility of the situation. It is very easy and, in fact, common to become somehow fixated on fanciful thinking. In some ways, we begin to imagine that it must have been a mistake or they confused them with someone else. There was an identity mistake. We begin to think all kinds of things in the fantasy of our mind. Denial is something that allows us to just take in very small doses the impact of our loss. But denial is something that must give way to reality. Ultimately, we must accept the loss. Accepting the reality of the loss is demonstrated in simple and practical ways, in adjustments that we make to our daily lives. And we can see and recognize when we're not making progress in this area in some very practical ways as well. The prolonged refusal to clean closets may indicate non-acceptance. It's something to pay attention to. Taking down pictures or removing all traces of the deceased, even though to some extent that needs to happen, but to try to obliterate the memory of our lost loved one is something that may indicate a lack of acceptance, although it doesn't seem that way to us, perhaps. As in the image of the horizon, we do not know just how far off the horizon lies. We cannot determine the depth of the sea or the currents that are present. This is the way of grief. We can't see it all. We don't know when it will end. But in this photograph, in this image, the grief and acceptance is somehow indicated, because even with the sea just churning in the background, and even with that horizon being so far off, We see this image of light and love as this heart kind of illumines the landscape. In grief, acceptance is enabled. It enables us to begin to focus on the love of our loved one and not simply the loss. It begins to frame our experience. Common responses to grief, and you will see the list on your screen, and if not, then you also have hard copies of it. The physical symptoms or responses to grief that we all experience at one time or another: feelings of tightness in the throat and heaviness in the chest, an empty feeling in the stomach, and often a loss of appetite, decreased strength, and difficulty sleeping. Some of the psycho-spiritual dimensions or responses are things such as guilt feelings, restlessness, and a need for activity, accompanied by the inability to concentrate, and with that, the inability to finish things that are started. Some of these things overlap these various areas. They could be psycho-spiritual, they could be emotional still, and so don't worry so much about what category they are in. This is simply to help us to get just a sense of things. Denial and feeling that the loss isn't real, too, is one of the responses to grief. A sense of the loved one's presence, hearing their voice, seeing their face, smelling their cologne, expecting them to walk in the door at their usual time. Dreams about the loved one, assuming the mannerisms or traits of our loved ones. These are all ways that we seek gradually to relinquish their life and to embrace the fact that they are no longer with us. But we do this, as I have said, little by little. And finally, emotional. The emotional responses to loss. A need to remember things about the loved one and their death, and sometimes being slightly preoccupied with their death, to tell and to retell the story. But this is our way, too, of working it through. It is a way in which we seek to come to acceptance, to understand and to comprehend what is indeed an enormous loss for us. Our preoccupation with the life of the deceased, anger at the loved one for leaving, a need to alleviate the discomfort of others, in other words, to move into more or less a caretaker role of the people who should be taking care of us in our times of grief. And in some ways, that too becomes a way to avoid our grief, but it is necessary to work through it, crying at unexpected times. I can remember times when it didn't seem at all like I was thinking about my mother or my sister after her loss not too many years ago. And yet I might be walking down the hallway, or even if one time being in church and just bursting into tears unexpectedly, somehow being overtaken by grief. And that's okay. It is grief breaking through, having its way, and allowing us as grievers to express what is most necessary. But abnormal responses to grief are also something to pay attention to. And we might actually make a note to ourselves that in the recognition of some of these responses to grief, they indicate the need to call in professional, psychological, or medical intervention. acquisition of symptoms or illness of the deceased, prolonged social isolation, furious hostility, total absence of affect, being robot-like, catatonic, loss of initiative and decisiveness, self-punitive behavior, aggressive, violent, impulsive behavior, lingering depression, increasing anxiety, lingering despair, lingering dependency. Crystal Anton said or wrote, "Feel the feeling, but don't become the emotion. Witness it and allow it and release it." And that is instructive to us, not to deny it, to acknowledge it, and to allow it to have its say, but not to become a stronghold in our lives. If that happens, there is help available. And we come finally to the third image, and in this image of the Passion, the colors, tone, and atmosphere of the rendering of Christ as he prepares for his Passion sets the tone for our biblical reflection today. Acceptance of the reality of the loss. Grief in the biblical narrative. Your assignment was to read Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 42. This story takes place on the night of Jesus' arrest, after the Last Supper with his disciples, in a somber occasion shrouded in the mystery surrounding the impending death of Jesus. The question that we begin with is, what does this narrative teach us about grief? What does it tell us? First of all, and know that this is not in any way an exhaustive rendering of this text, but these are thoughts that we can reflect on and that can enable us to also better understand our own experiences. Jesus seeks the support of his inner circle. Someone once said to me, a seminarian who was coming before the Committee for Preparation of Ministry, and I was on that committee, I remember her saying in her paper that we all need the gift of some-otherness. And her words spoke to me and have stayed with me. The intensity of Jesus' his grief necessitated for him the presence of his community. He doesn't try to bring all of his disciples. That would have been way too big a crowd. But as he often did, Jesus takes with him Peter, James, and John to the garden where he seeks to pray. He instructs them in verse 32, "Sit here while I pray." And he did not try to go it alone. He was there in community. Community is a vital part of coming to acceptance, even as much as experiencing our grief, which we talked about last week. The presence and prayers of others are paramount for our healing, in our times of healing. And just think about it for a moment. Jesus didn't take with him the most alert people. He did not take with him people who were perfect and even so religious and upright. These were his disciples. He knew his disciples. They were flawed. They were forgetful. They were often fearful. But they are the ones he chose to take with him. because they are the ones he loved. Second, Jesus remains emotionally honest. This is a point that we cannot stress too much. Our emotional honesty is what puts us in a position for acceptance. Jesus expresses in verse 34, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death." And in verse 33, it reads, "He began to be troubled and deeply distressed." Jesus experiences, in this case, anticipatory grief, which we covered last week. That is the real and present grief that is anticipating what is to come. In other words, Jesus is anticipating the cross. It has not yet happened, but he knows it is happening. He knows it will be the end of his life, but also he knows it will be his separation from his beloved followers. There are many levels at which Jesus grieves, and perhaps, and maybe most of all, the grief of the anticipation of this death of shame. Emotional honesty, both verbal and nonverbal, is key to coming to acceptance. If we could just say exactly where we are and feel the freedom to say it, not to have others try to correct our theology, although it's often off a bit during times of grief. But there's no need to be corrected. We simply need to be heard, each of us. Anticipatory grief is pervasive. It is pervasive in our lives even today. Within our own church community right now, there are multiple instances where families and members are anticipating the eventual loss of loved ones. Anticipated grief. Grief through Alzheimer's, through debilitating diseases, through various kinds of cancers. All of these things take a toll, and we don't grieve them all at once, but little by little as our loved one, as their bodies give way, and sometimes as their minds give way to these diseases. And little by little, we can entrust them to God's care. And third, Jesus persists in prayer. This lesson teaches us that Jesus prayed all the way through. It's interesting that his prayer is the same prayer each time. It is repetitive. But he prays to the one he called Abba Father, which is to say, Daddy God. It's a term of endearment that indicates a close relationship with the Father, that Jesus trusted and loved the one he called Abba. Grief can engender deepening faith for us. It can actually broaden and deepen our prayer lives. That Jesus prays 3 times suggests that he persists in prayers. It's not about being accurate about the number of times he prayed. The number 3 indicates that he did not give up, that he kept going to God and kept going to God. In Matthew's gospel, another narrative world, Jesus teaches to keep knocking, to keep seeking, to keep asking. It is that lesson toward persistence and understanding that the answers to the prayers we pray will not come in an instant, most likely. Sometimes that happens, but I would say it's rare. Typically, our prayer lives are not simply about us asking God for what it is we need and getting it. It is about our drawing near to God. It is about our learning to love and trust God at the deepest levels of our being. 3 times Jesus prayed the same prayer. Let this pass. Let this cup pass from me. Don't let this happen, Lord. And yet, he prayed until something happened. Sometimes we imagine that we keep praying until we get what we ask for, but sometimes what we get is what we most need. And what Jesus most needed was not so much to have the cup pass from him. What he needed was to come to peace with what he himself understood to be the pinnacle of his passion and his mission. It is important to remember that Jesus prayed 3 times, because in grief it can seem like that horizon, that things are so far off that we will never ever get to the place of resolve. But coming to acceptance means that we persist in prayer. It is easy to imagine that our prayers are yielding nothing, that our prayers are in vain, and we want to give up prayer as a hopeless endeavor. But to come to acceptance means that we persevere until we, like Jesus, find that God has changed our own hearts, that our own desires, the things that we thought we needed, that we couldn't live without, the one we thought we could not live without, we find that we can move forward and we can carry their memory. And in our moving forward, we honor their life. Persist in prayer. Jesus persists to the point that he is able to say, "Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." And fourth, Jesus stands in solidarity with us. The Jesus we encounter in Mark's gospel is the suffering servant. He does not stand in his divinity, rather he kneels in his finite humanity. Mark's Jesus is perhaps the most human of all the accounts of Jesus in the 4 Gospels. He stands in stark contrast to the Gospel of John, a high Christology gospel. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is not exempt from his pain or suffering, but he is able to empathize with us because he is the suffering servant. He is the one who himself suffered. Therefore, when we call on Jesus, when we pray and we ask Jesus to be present with us, we know that Jesus shows up and that he can stand with us because he knows more than anyone what it is to suffer and what it is to experience grief. Acceptance comes as we discover that Jesus is intimately acquainted with our own grief and will lead us through and beyond the pain of our loss. He will lead us to the point of acceptance when one day, not so far away, we too will be able to pray, "Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." Well, this concludes our session for today. And I want to remind us of our opening exercise, our spiritual practice of relinquishment. And I encourage you throughout the week to return to that practice. If and when it feels like the grief is getting the better of you, that it's on top of you, imagine yourself holding that grief before God. And imagine God's hands underneath yours, And once again, entrust to God your grief. For our next session, and that video recording should be available beginning Friday, and we will actually do our grief debriefing. I will get that time and date to you, but I will be moving it away from Tuesday morning, as we have a number of pantry workers who wanted to be a part of that. And of course, they can't do it because the pantry is going on at that time. But I will be in touch with you about that. So for your homework, your reading for next week or for the end of this week is Romans 8, verses 31 to 39, and 1 Corinthians 1, 3 through 4. God bless you and keep you is my prayer. Until next time, bye-bye.